this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening Remake for the Nintendo Switch. Before I start the review, I need to say that I played this game in an emulator. Specifically, it was for Ujinx. Also, for the first hour of gameplay, I had the resolution scale set to 2 times, but it was causing FPS issues, which then caused stuttering issues, so I changed it back to native. So if you're wondering why the first hour of gameplay footage looks sharper than the rest of the gameplay footage, that's why. I also want to note that I did almost 100% complete this game. I got all of the heart pieces, seashells, bottles, which are something that was added to the remake. I completed the color temple, I got the boomerang, and I did most of Dampé's chamber dungeons. I didn't do the last 12 because the rewards for doing that was getting 300 rupees each time you complete one of the last 12 chamber dungeons. So I decided it wasn't worth my time and didn't do those. I also didn't get all of the figurines because if you get all 10 out of the trendy game, you get a chamber stone for the chamber dungeon minigame, and since I already decided that I wasn't going to do the last 12 chamber dungeons, I didn't get the rest of the figurines. The only two I got were the Yoshi ones since it's a requirement to get it, and I also got the Chow Chow figurine while I was grinding for rupees. So I'm sitting here wondering what to write for this review since I literally just reviewed the DX version of this game very recently, and this is a 1-to-1 remake, meaning that most of everything is going to be the same, and since most of everything is the same, most of my thoughts on this game are the same as the DX version. You know what? I'll talk about a few of the changes that I noticed. If you want a deep dive review of the game as a whole, I would recommend you watch my review of the DX version of the game. Let's start the review. For those of you that are wondering how faithful this game is to the Game Boy Color version, it's pretty faithful with the geography since it's almost the exact same for the overworld, and from what I could tell, the geography of the temples hasn't changed. In terms of what I mean by the overworld being almost the same, they added some small crevices to the overworld to hide some of the new heart pieces and seashells. And yeah, you heard me right, they added more heart pieces and seashells to this game. The DX version had 12 heart pieces, and the remake has 32. And if you do the math, that is 20 new heart pieces, which is a lot. In terms of seashells, the DX version of the game had 26, and the remake has 50. And if you do the math, that is 24 new seashells, which is also a lot. On top of the fact that in the DX version of the game, you only needed 20 to get the upgraded sword, and rewards also stopped at 20. Whereas in the remake, you need 40 to get the upgraded sword, and rewards stop at 50. A major change with this version of the game is that there is way less loading segments compared to the DX version, especially in the overworld, and this is where it's most noticeable. In the DX version of the game, the overworld was divided up into several small rooms, and you would hit a very short loading segment every 5 steps you took, whereas in the remake, a lot of these loading segments don't exist. You can just keep walking, and this is a really nice change because it creates a more seamless experience. This also allows for you to use the Pegasus boots as a method of fast transportation, which is very useful and cool. Speaking of transportation, they added more fast travel points, which in my opinion is nice because it makes it easier to get from point A to point B. Speaking of transportation, that reminds me that they made a major change with the movement and and the camera angle. So the game is still top down, but now it's 2.5D, allowing you to move diagonally, along with still being able to move left, right, up, down, which I think is a nice change. The camera angle is no longer giving you the viewing experience of seeing everything from top to bottom, but is now giving you the angle of a crane shot, which is where you see everything at a diagonal angle, making the environment look 3D. Something I want to mention real quick is that they made it easier to figure out which direction you need to go in, because the owl is more specific with his dialogue, and he also shows up more often, usually just as a reminder to tell you what direction you need to go in. So I figured I would just mention this detail real quick. I want to talk about the items real quick, and in the review of the DX version of the game, I said that most of the items in the game are underused, and since this is a one-to-one remake, that remains to be true. However, I wanted to mention that they added 3 bottles that you can put fairies in, and you can use them as revives or as manual heals, which is cool, despite that it's not really necessary considering how easy this game is. I also want to talk about the feather, and I didn't mention this in my review of the DX version of the game, but I'll mention it now. I don't get why they added this item to the game. The whole point of the feather is that you use it to jump gaps, and you can also use the Pegasus boots to sprint and then use the feather to jump across a large gap. I just don't see the point in the feather existing. Just let me walk to the other side of the room. To be clear, I find the amount of holes that I have to jump over to be mildly annoying, but it's not anything that's going to ruin the game. Although a massive improvement that they made with the remake is that since the Joy-Cons and the Pro Controller have more buttons than the Game Boy Color, you can have more than 2 items equipped at a time. Now, I know that there's still only 2 item slots, however, they binded a lot of the items to buttons on the controller. This change means that you don't have to open the item menu as often, which is an awesome change. However, I can understand some people's disappointment that they can't change the items that are permanently binded to one of the buttons to a different button. A very major change that I haven't mentioned yet is that they made the combat in the remake even easier than it was in the DX version, and I think this was expected considering that Nintendo has made their games very easy since the 90s or 2000s. The way they made combat easier in this version of the game is by making the enemies' attacks slower, making their movements slower, and also making them not attack as often. This applies to enemies in the overworld and enemies inside of the temples. This also applies to boss fights. In terms of my opinion on this change, I don't really care that they made the combat super easy and not even remotely challenging, because it was already like that in the DX version of the game, and in general, Nintendo games aren't that hard and have been that way since the 90s or the 2000s. So for me, I just go in expecting the game to be easy, although for the Zelda games, I'm hoping that the geographical puzzles and any other type of puzzle is thought-provoking, and so far, the past 3 games, those being A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening DX, and the remake of Link's Awakening, have made the geographical puzzles thought-provoking, so it's achieved its success in that department. A quick thing I want to mention is that the DX version of the game had an issue where some of the hitboxes would stretch too far vertically, or I say some of the hitboxes. Pretty much almost all the hitboxes, or just all of the hitboxes, would have this issue where it would look like they'd be stretching further vertically than they should, which is up and down. However, in the remake, this is not an issue. And I remember in the DX version, it was particularly an issue with enemies that would go in the air, but that's also not an issue in the remake. And in general, with the remake, it's much easier to tell when enemies are in the air versus when they're on the ground, which is really nice. And the 2 2.5D probably helps with that as well. A small thing I want to mention real quick is the swimming in this game, because in my review for the DX version of the game, I said that swimming above water and underwater was too slow. And in this version of the game, they made it faster, which is nice, and I would say that you move at acceptable speeds when you're swimming either above water or underwater in the remake. I want to talk about the chamber dungeon minigame next. This is a new minigame that they added to the remake, and this replaces the photo album. In this minigame, you build dungeons with the parameters that are set in place and within the layout that they give you. I would recommend that if you are going to do this minigame at all, that you wait until after you have beaten all 8 temples, and also do the colored temple, because they don't give you all the tiles all at once. And this minigame is much easier to do when you have all the tiles that you can get from just beating the temples. My primary reason for doing this minigame was to get the heart piece and heart container that you can get from completing the first 3 tiers, and I also got a bottle, so that was a nice surprise. They also have a free mode, which I didn't touch that, but I liked this minigame, and I think that if people are interested in building their own 2.5D top-down Zelda dungeons, they can do that in free mode, or at the very least, to some extent, in free mode. This minigame, and especially when I saw the free mode, made me wish for a 2.5D top-down Zelda maker, along with a 3D Zelda maker, or just a Zelda maker with both options, but that's never going to happen. A major change, and this one is obvious, but they redid all of the graphics, and I think most of them look pretty good, although there's some things to me that look like toy dolls, such as any human character, including Link himself. I don't like that some of the things look like toy dolls, and I don't think that's something they should have intentionally went for, but they did, and I just tolerated it. They also, for some reason, made Moldrum look like a hamburger in the remake, and I don't know why. To be clear, they did execute the art style well, despite my subjective opinion on some of the things not looking good. Speaking of the graphics, I love the new menus. It looks a lot better, and a small detail that I liked about the item menu is that when you hover over the ocarina, it doesn't automatically open the submenu for it to pick which song you want to equip, which is so nice because that was so annoying in the DX version of the game when I was going through the item menu. The map menu also got a massive upgrade. They made it way more detailed to the point that you can see the grass and the rocks on the map. Another major thing they added on the map was labeling the areas, and when you're walking around and enter a different area, the name of the area shows up in the top left hand corner of the screen, which is a really big quality of life change. Another major change that they made is with the music. Most of the music in the remake has been completely changed, and not very many of the tracks from the DX version of the game are in the remake. For some people, they'll like the new music, some people won't like the new music. I didn't pay too much attention to the music beyond that I noticed that a majority of it was different, so I can't really give an opinion on whether the new music was any good or not. What I can say though is the fact that most of the music was replaced makes the music department in the remake not very faithful to the original. Now the ultimate question here is, which version version of the game do I prefer and recommend? The DX version or the remake? And the answer is the remake because it smooths out a few of the rough edges that the DX version of the game had, but the DX version is still fine. It's time to give the score, and I'm giving The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening Remake for the Nintendo Switch a 5 out of 6. I'm excited to start playing the N64 version of Ocarina of Time because I hear that is a really good game along with its 3DS remake, and I also hear the same for the N64 version of Majora's Mask and its 3DS remake as well. That's about it. See ya.